Hey everybody, this is a piece from the Alliance for Workers' Liberty. It was published in Workers' Liberty, I'm not sure what year, but it's titled the quote, Third Camp, end quote, in France. And the description says Yvan Craipeau, who died at the end of 2001, age 90, was the first Trotskyist to argue systematically that the Stalinist USSR was not a degenerated worker state, but a new system of class exploitation. He had been convinced since 1934 that the USSR was no longer a worker state, and in 1937 he had debated the question with Trotsky in writing. In the myth-ridden orthodox histories of the evolution of Marxist thinking on the USSR, including academic accounts and Isaac Deutscher's well-known biography of Trotsky, Craipeau's ideas are typically attached to Bruno Rizzi, a maverick and eccentric who repeated some of them in 1939. Jean-René Chauvin and Paul Parisot were among Yvan Craipeau's close comrades in the leadership of the French Trotskyist movement, the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, in the 1940s. They spoke to Martin Thomas about the struggles and debates of that time and their lessons for today. So here we go. I think this is kind of like an interview piece, so it might be a little awkward, but I think we'll get through it. Parisot became active as a student socialist in 1934 and joined the Trotskyists in September 1935. Chauvin joined the Trotskyist movement at the end of 1936 from the Gauche Revolutionnaire, a left current in the Socialist Party. France had long been a central country for the Trotskyist movement, There were quibbles, squabbles, departures, though, even more in France than other countries where the hard-pressed Trotskyists organized. In 1935, there was a large split. Raymond Molinier, long suspect in the eyes of many of his comrades as a businessman and a political quote, entrepreneur, full of schemes but short on theory, took a contingent off around a supposedly broad left paper, La Commune. Actually, La Commune was never anything, quote, broader than any other Trotskyist paper, and Molinier soon recognized that, but the split was lasting. During World War II, the Trotskyists were divided into two main groups, the Molinierists, minus Molinier, who was now in South America, organized the CCI, and denounced the other group, the POI, led by Yvan Craipeau and Marcel Hick, for its efforts to integrate concern for the national rights of the French people under Nazi occupation into socialist politics. In February 1944, the groups were reunited. Between then and 1948, the Trotskyist movement, called the Parti Communiste, it says PCI, but I think it's the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, grew from some 100 to maybe 1,000 strong and had more impact than it had had before or would have again until 1968. But the political situation in France and internationally was one difficult to orient in, and there were sharp arguments among the Trotskyists. The wing led by Yvan Craipeau was regarded as, quote, right-wing by the other wing, led by some ex-millennialists such as Pierre Franck, Jacques Privat, and Pierre Lambert, and some ex-POIers whom they in turn regarded as sectarians and phrasemongers. The Frank wing held the leadership until 1946, and the Craipeau wing then until 1947. In 1948, the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, buffeted by the Cold War and the Communist Party's demagogic turn to the left, fell apart. Most of the Craipeau wing left in search of broader political frameworks. By mid-1952, the PCI was down to about 150 members, and then it split again. Only small groups were left to struggle through 1968, which they did, though accumulating much baggage of political confusion on the way. Okay. So I guess that's a introduction by Martin Thomas. I'm not sure. I'm guessing though. It could all. It's not clearly said. But now Parisot is speaking. In the 1940s, there was a majority in the French Trotskyist movement, undeclared and unorganized, who questioned the theory which Trotsky continued to defend. We were not convinced, especially after the publication in France of The Revolution Betrayed by Trotsky in 1937, that one could talk of a degenerated worker state in the USSR. There was no longer any element of a worker state. What served as the argument for the thesis of the degenerated worker state was that private property and the means of production and exchange had been replaced by the collectivist property of the Soviet bureaucracy. So we were divided among supporters of the ideas of state capitalism or bureaucratic capitalism or bureaucratic collectivism. I am still of the same opinion as Craipeau on that subject, that none of the formulations amounts to a programmatic basis. What mattered was our daily activities in France, especially in relation to the Stalinist Party. That is why in 1946 we did not push for a debate on the USSR. We wanted to remit the question of the characterization of the USSR to a serious scientific inquiry. There was one person who did something in that direction, not conclusive but interesting studies, and that was Charles Bettelheim. Later he became a Maoist, and a very prominent academic figure, but Bettelheim nevertheless developed a serious critique. For us, the formulation on the USSR was not decisive. What was decisive was to push the Communist Party first not to disarm the, quote, patriotic militias, end quote, and not to accept the deal which de Gaulle, post-war president of France, and then to push the Communist Party and the left of the Socialist Party support working class struggles, to which they were very hostile until the episode of spring 1947 of the Renault strike. The Communist Party did not support the strike at first. The Socialist youth supported it, and the real cause for the expulsion of the Socialist Party of the leading comrades of the Socialist youth was their support for the strike. Guy Mollet, who had just taken over the leadership of the SFIO, the Socialist Party, expelled them on the pretext of, quote, factional activity by Trotskyists inside the Socialist youth, end quote. Wikipedia says Guy Mollet lived from 1905 to 1975 and was a French politician. Guy Mollet led the socialist section of the Workers' International, SFIO, from 1946 to 1969 and was the French Prime Minister from 1956 to 1957. As Prime Minister, Guy Mollet passed some significant domestic reforms and worked for European integration, proposing the Franco-British Union. He became unpopular in both the left and the right of the country for his international policy, especially during the Suez Crisis and the Algerian War. Back to the text. In the end, the split of the socialist youth, supported by the Trotskyists, pushed the Communist Party to change its position and to support the Renault strike. The consequence was that Ramadier threw them out of the government, and the Communist Party remained excluded from the direction of the country for 34 years. This is referring to Paul Ramadier, which Wikipedia says lived from 1888 to 1961 and was a French statesman. Back to the text. All that did not contribute at all to bringing the Communist Party closer to a revolutionary tactic. On the contrary, it became stuck in ultra-Stalinism, violent in the forms of struggle, On some demonstrations, they took placards made of iron so as to bash the police with them, but with a politics which consisted of trying to get back into government in one form or another. And now it's Jean-René Chauvin. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name right at all, so forgive me. Chauvin says, in the period that followed, the Communist Party still considered itself as a party of government. The Russians were not content to see the French Communist Party marginalized. They hoped to do in France what they had done in Central Europe, to gain control of the state machine, to colonize the state machine in one way or another, rather than to base themselves on the masses, where they had control. In Toulouse, it was like Poland. Bracket, given the character of the Communist Party, was it right for revolutionaries to call for the seizure of power by the Communist Party at that time? In 1944 to 47, the Communist Party was a big force, facing a bourgeois state machine that scarcely existed. The Trotskyists demanded a Communist Party / Socialist Party government, but if we look at the countries where the Communist Party took power, it was not good for the working class, in bracket. I'm assuming that bracket is Martin Thomas asking a question, I'm guessing. I'm not sure. And Chauvin again. At the time, I agreed with that slogan, but on reflection, it was a mistake. I was skeptical even at the time as a result of the experiences I had had in the concentration camps with Russian prisoners. They had political commissars, and their conduct was nothing in common with socialist politics. I discussed with those of them whom one could discuss, and they thought that the revolution in France, in Europe more generally, would happen thanks to the Red Army, without reference to the masses of the people. Of course, I was not able to have very deep discussions with them, and besides, I was in the same block as those political commissars only for a short time. And Parisot says, on this particular point, I would say that we were making a gamble. If the Communist Party had put itself on the side of the workers' demands, if it had taken the risk of entering into conflict with de Gaulle and a whole section of the bourgeoisie and the petty bourgeoisie around that great center-right regroupment, which was the MRP, bracket, the main establishment party of the time, in bracket, then the communists risked creating a situation in which a differentiation would develop even inside the Communist Party. We thought that the mass movement after the war was sufficiently powerful to provoke breaks between Stalinism and the authentically working class forces. That was the basis of our gamble. To go back, what characterized our current and what did we in 1946 to 47? What characterized our current and what we did in 1946 to 47 was an argument which went back right to the start of the war. In 1940, at a time when we were the majority of the little group which would become Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste, POI, that majority was led by Marcel Hick with the support of David Rousset and a series of very young comrades. Sorry, I'm seeing if there's Wikipedias for these people. David Rousset lived from 1912 to 1997 and was a French writer and political activist, a recipient of Prix Renaudot, a French literary award, a survivor of the Neuengamme concentration camp and the Buchenwald Nazi concentration camp. He is famous for his books about concentration camps. David Rousseau is the first person to use the term, quote, gulag in the French left, revealing to the French the Soviet system of labor camps. In 1949, learning that while the concentration camps in Nazi Germany had been destroyed, camps still existed in the Soviet Union, David Rousseau appealed to former inmates of Nazi camps to form a commission to inspect the USSR camps, which became the, quote, International Commission Against Concentrationist Regimes, end quote. For his efforts, he was attacked by Pierre Daille in the French communist newspaper Les Lettres Françaises, which accused him of slandering the Soviet Union, forging the text of the Soviet laws, and spreading misinformation. Rousseau brought libel charges against the newspaper, and in 1951 he won the case. Along with Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, and Gerard Rosenthal, Rousseau was a founder of the left-wing Rassemblement Démocratique Revolutionary Democratic Rally, which called for a European federation on democratic socialist lines. In 1968, David Rousseau was elected as a deputy to the French National Assembly as a left-wing Gaullist. He resigned in November 1970. Back to the text. The majority is led by Marcel Hick with the support of David Rousseau and a series of very young comrades. The debate between the two groups which subscribed to the Fourth International, the Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste and the CCI, essentially the Millennialists, was about where or not there was a national question in France due to the German occupation. The Millennialists said no, and they pushed their own logic far enough to have comrades doing entry work in a fascist and collaborationist party, the RNP of Dazat, originating from the right wing of the Socialist Party. Bracket, organizing from a right wing of the Socialist Party. I should say, in fairness, that inside the CCI, Lebert differentiated himself from their disdain for the national question. On the other hand, we thought that we should constitute, inside the nebulous current of the resistance, a group which was working class and revolutionary, but also fought against the occupation. All the discussion just after the liberation revolved around this argument and one other problem. Pierre Franck developed a theory according to which capitalism following the Second World War would be incapable of reconstructing Europe, and thus becoming stuck in impotence and crisis. It would create new revolutionary opportunities. We, on the other hand, saw that the reconstruction had actually begun, not only in France but across Europe, including Germany. If one speculated on rising difficulties for capitalism and consequent revolutionary opportunities, one would follow the Millennialists. If, on the contrary, one put that estimate in question, that was at the center of the Congress where we took the majority, bracket, in 1946, end bracket, then one turned more to the tactic of the United Front. It was like the situation the Bolsheviks faced in 1921-2, when Lenin and Trotsky pointed out that there was a certain stabilization of capitalism. It would not last forever, but it was there for the moment, and thus one could no longer reject all alliances with social democracy. Braddock put it one way when he said to the Germans, yes, we must sit at the same table as the assassins of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. We thought we should follow the ideas of the Third Congress of the Third International. We had close relations with Shachtman's group at the time. Shachtman stayed in France for a while. Shachtman was a remarkable speaker who could speak in 4 or 5 languages, and he won a lot of sympathy among us. In 1945-46, 3 American leaders came to France, first Shachtman, then Cannon, then Goldman. While we were the leadership, The party's official position was still that the USSR was a degenerated worker state. The open proclaimed break with what had been Trotsky's old doctrine was made by the group which became Socialissimo Barbarie, especially Claude Lefort and Cornelius Castoriadis. Our opinion was that it was best not to have an official party doctrine, but to continue the discussion. And now, Chauvin is speaking again. Although we were interested by what Castoriadis said theoretically, on the political level, Castoriadis represented quite ultra-left positions. It was difficult to work with Castoriadis' group. They contented themselves with being a group of intellectuals. Later on, they posed to themselves the question of activity in the workplaces, but it did not get very far. They remained a group of intellectuals. They developed some interesting ideas, but it led to nothing. We knew about the hypothesis of Burnham, which assimilated the extension of the Soviet bureaucratic regime to the growth of managerial layers in Western capitalism. We did not follow that view. We saw Stalinism as something in evolution. It was showing itself even more reactionary when it destroyed the workers' movement in the so-called people's democracies, bracket, of Eastern Europe, end bracket. We had a moment of hope at the time of the split between the USSR and Yugoslavia, bracket, in 1948, end bracket. We thought that maybe in Yugoslavia there was a regeneration of the communist movement. I went to Belgrade as a correspondent for France, Observateur. We were well received as Trotskyists by the upper circles, but in the population it was different. There was strong opposition. There was a certain number of discussions in the Yugoslav Communist Party, but when Gilas came out with his critical views, it was all stopped, and the bureaucratic control was reconstituted. There was industrial self-management, but it was self-management on paper. Parisot says, what decides the character of an economy is not the economic relations, but in the last analysis, the social relations. The social relations that existed in a country were a small group, or at the limit, one person like Stalin. The social relations that existed in a country where a small group, or at the limit, one person like Stalin could dispose of all the productive forces to refine a regime which is not far from capitalism. But we had discussions on Palestine too, starting in the PSOP, bracket, before the war, end bracket. In 1945 became an issue in the organization that I had spoken in a meeting in defense of a Zionist who was threatened with being hung by the British in Palestine. And Chauvin says, we were for a binational state in Palestine after we were excluded from the Parti Communiste Internationaliste, bracket, in 1948, end bracket. We produced a magazine called Confrontations Internationale. It lasted for 4 issues. It's probably Confrontation Internationale. It lasted for 4 issues. The Shachtmanites were involved, and Maximilien Rubel, one of the best French editors of Marx's writings. Parisot says, Craipeau bore the burden of being the artisan of the fusion with the millennialist in 1944. Later, I think, Craipeau recognized that he had made a serious mistake. At the time of the liberation, bracket, of Paris from the Nazis, end bracket, the main thing was to get a newspaper. All the groups, large or small, seized a newspaper, but the millennialists would not do it. They were sectarian. Chauvin says, the millennialists had an almost religious position on the USSR as the workers' state, bracket, but in 1937 they had officially renounced the view that the USSR was a worker state, returning to it only at the start of the war, end bracket. Parisot says, it was just an immediate reaction to the break between Molinier and Trotsky. Chauvin says, everything was really decided in the course of the resistance. After that, those groups that did not have arms were marginalized. There had been an underestimation of the national liberation character of the fight against the Nazis. Parisot says, the Molinierists had a position of rejecting any kind of alliance, neither Washington nor Moscow, nor London, nor de Gaulle, nor anyone at all. Our tendency failed essentially because we were defeated by the Molinierists. The Molinierists conducted a factional struggle everywhere, based on a naive belief in the imminent collapse of Stalinism. The international leadership was on their side. Our tendency was considered to be rightist because it was a working class tendency which tried to play a role in the trade unions as the trade unions actually were. The Molinierists were a caricature of Bolshevism, all the faults of Bolshevism with none of the merits. And Chauvin says, after Confrontation Internationale, I was active in the RDR, Rassemblement Démocratique Révolutionnaire, a, quote, third camp, end quote, group launched by David Rousset, Jean-Paul Sartre, and others, end bracket. So I don't see it. I was looking for a piece on that group, but there's no, like a Wikipedia article for that group, but there isn't one. And Parisot says, everyone went their own way. We are for quitting the nebulous Fourth International and integrating themselves into the broader workers or trade union organizations. I joined up with a newspaper called Franc Tireur, put out mostly by former communists who had broken with the Communist Party, but also members of Souverain Circle and an old leader of the PSOP, Jean-René. I have a piece on here about Souverain and Trotsky by Dan Labatz. Is this the same guy? No. I joined up with a newspaper called Franc Tireur, put out mostly by former communists who had broken with the Communist Party, but also including members of Souverain Circle and an old leader of the PSOP, Jean-René. We went into the SFIO, Socialist Party, until the Algerian War. Then I joined a little group which later became one of the components of what would become the PSU, bracket, a left split from the Socialist Party, end bracket. And Chauvin says, after the RDR, I made contact with the editorial board of Franc Tireur. Then I was in the Nouvelle Gauche, the Union de la Then I was in the Nouvelle Gauche, the Union de la Gauche Socialiste, and the PSA and the PSU. It's the end of the piece. Thank you for listening.